Subira Tulzidi Caravanner is a mono-red human shaman that's actually probably a rogue. She lets you discard your hand and practically dies to Darksteel Mutation. But wait, there's more! Let's talk about why you might want Subira to lead your next commander deck. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. My name is Eric, and this channel is dedicated to unconventional commander decks and strategies. And today, let's try out Mono Red. I've been hesitant to play red as a monocolor because I like to be able to whack scary things. And outside of a very few select cards, red is quite bad at whacking things that have high toughness, and things that are enchantments. In fact, I started building a self-discard burn deck with Hazoret the Fervent, but then my opponent put Pariah on it. So I was like, well, yep, GG. So I promptly forgot about Hazoret, and instead we're going to try out Subira Tulzidi Caravanner. Now Subira is a 2/3 human shaman that costs 200 red. She has haste, and you can pay 1 to make another target creature with power 2 or less unblockable this turn. You can also pay 1 and a red and tap her, and discard your hand, and until end of turn, whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player this turn, you draw a card. Now I think you've got 2 general ways that you can build with Subira. First, you can use her last ability to draw a bunch of cards. So if you make a bunch of creature tokens, and then use Subira to make those tokens unblockable if you really need to, and then use her second ability to discard your hand and draw a bunch of cards when all of those tokens deal combat damage to players. Because again, she'll draw you a card for each creature that you connect with, so you really want a lot of creatures getting in for combat damage to really take advantage of this ability. Now you can alternatively focus on creatures that give you some value when they hit an opponent, and other effects like equipment that have triggers when you deal combat damage to an opponent. This version of a Subira deck would focus on quality instead of quantity. Focusing on Subira's first ability to make some key creatures unblockable to get those powerful combat damage triggers. But we might not have as many creatures getting in for combat damage, so Subira's second ability won't be quite as reliable in this form of a Subira deck. And this second method is how I've built this deck. We're going to use small creatures with power 2 or less that love to deal combat damage to players, and we'll use Subira to help them get in. And that's the basic strategy. Of course, we have redundancies and alternative game plans, but we'll get into those momentarily. So let's talk about the contents of this deck, starting with some of our creatures that just love to deal combat damage. Now we're focused on using Subira to help specific creatures get in for combat damage against our opponents. Creatures that provide extra value or extra pressure against our opponents when they connect. Grenzo Havoc Raiser is one of the best and most powerful examples. It's a 2/2, and it has whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you choose 1. Goad target creature that player controls, or exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn you may cast that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. And this trigger occurs for every creature you control that deals combat damage, so you can have multiple of these triggers going off every single combat step. So Grenzo is, to put it simply, very awesome. He gives this combat damage trigger again, not just to himself, but to all of your other creatures too. You can steal your opponent's non-land cards, or use it defensively to goad creatures and prevent them from attacking you. But we also have Robber of the Rich. This also steals your opponent's cards when it attacks, but it only triggers when that opponent that you're attacking has more cards in hand than you. Now this is great here for 2 reasons. First, Subira lets you discard your hand in order to draw more cards, so you can pretty much always have fewer cards in hand than your opponents, if you really want to. Secondly, even though Robber of the Rich's ability triggers on attack, not on combat damage, well, it's still just a 2/2, so Subira can make it unblockable so that Robber of the Rich is much more likely to survive combat, so you can keep using its ability over and over again. Now, I also like Terra Ravager and Coastline Marauders. These guys have 0 power, so Subira can make them unblockable, but when they attack, they get +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of lands the defending player controls. So these creatures can get in for huge amounts of unblockable damage, especially if your opponents are ramping a lot of lands onto the battlefield. Just note that when they deal combat damage, they won't have power 2 or less, so you won't be able to draw cards off of them with Subira's second activated ability. There's of course Scythe Claw and equipment with Living Weapon, and when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half of their life, so I like this one especially because it comes with a body. And then there's Umezawa's Jite, which gets 2 charge counters whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage. Now this damage can be to a creature or a player, but at least if we make our creature unblockable with Subira, it'll be likely to survive combat. And you can use those charge counters to buff your creature, which is awesome if you've already made it unblockable, or you can remove small creatures or even gain life. Umezawa's Jite is one of my favorite equipments. It's extremely versatile, and yes, it costs $20, but it's completely worth it, as long as you don't need to justify to your mother why you want her help paying your cell phone bill. Now, Subira doesn't do anything unless you have other creatures on the battlefield, so we'll use creatures for as much of our ramp, removal, and card draw as possible. Grotag Night Runner and Prophetic Flamespeaker are easy card advantage with Subira. The Night Runner lets you exile the top card of your library whenever it deals combat damage to a player, and you can play that card this turn. And the Flamespeaker does the same thing, but it also has double strike, so you get to do it twice. Bomat Courier is a nice little 1/1 with haste that can get in easily turn after turn, and eventually replenish your hand. We'll use some creatures that help us ramp too. The Magda Brazen Outlaw and Captain Lannery Storm basically give you a treasure token when they attack, and again, Subira can help ensure that these squishy dorks survive combat so they can do it again next turn. And of course there's Curse of Opulence, which is a curse that does the same thing, gives you a treasure whenever the cursed player is attacked. We'll even use some mana dorks like Iron Mirror, Mannequin, and Plague Mirror. They may be more vulnerable than mana rocks for ramp, but they can wear equipment like that Scythe Claw to help us get those combat damage triggers, and again, Subira can make all of these unblockable. Now I also like Scaretiller. This is a super janky 4 mana 1/4, and when it becomes tapped, you can either put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. You know, maybe a land you discarded with Subira or one of your other discard outlets, which we'll talk about later. So this is actual land-based mana ramp in mono red, which is awesome, and again, Scaretiller's power is 2 or less, so Subira can make it unblockable. You can easily attack with Scaretiller turn after turn to tap it and get that land ramp trigger. And then of course we'll use Sword of the Animist, which is kind of a staple in any deck that doesn't have green and plays at least some number of creatures. This is great repeatable land-based ramp. And just be aware that it gives the equipped creature +1/+1, so some of your creatures will go up above 2 power when you equip this, and that means that Subira won't be able to make them unblockable. Now when it comes to removal, we're mostly going to use non-creature spells, and I'll mention some of those later. But as far as creatures are concerned, I want to point out Goblin Vandal. This is a 1 mana 1/1 that gives you repeated artifact destruction. When Goblin Vandal attacks and isn't blocked, you can pay a red to destroy target artifact defending player controls. But if you do, Goblin Vandal deals no combat damage this turn. And just keep in mind that if you're trying to use Subira's second ability to draw cards, you won't be able to draw a card from Goblin Vandal if you use its triggered ability to destroy an artifact, since it won't actually deal combat damage. So those are some of our creatures that we like to get in for combat damage, and we're often relying on Subira to make that happen. So I've included a few redundancies in case our opponents disable our commander. Break Through the Line goes in a lot of Subira decks. This is a 2-mana enchantment that lets you pay red to give target creature with power 2 or less haste and unblockable until end of turn. So it's actually kind of better than Subira because of the haste. Whisper Silk Cloak is an equipment that gives the equipped creature Shroud and unblockable, so it'll be harder for your opponents to kill it. And of course Bedlam is an enchantment that just says creatures can't block. Now yes, that includes your creatures too, but this deck is filled with 2/2s and we don't really want to be blocking with those anyways. Now we really like Subira's ability to make our small creatures unblockable, but we won't ignore her second ability, which lets us discard our hand to hopefully draw some cards when our creatures get in for combat damage. So let's talk about some of our discard synergies next. Now red is really great at discarding cards, and Subira is no exception. Now, the ability to toss your hand into the garbage on demand is not exactly coveted in Commander, but we can put it to good use here. Glinthorn Buccaneer and Brelin Skyshark Rider, for example, deal 1 damage to your opponents whenever you discard a card. With Subira and some of our other card draw and discard effects, these two creatures are probably our best alternative non-combat win conditions. Mask of Memories and equipment that lets you draw 2 cards and discard 1 card whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. Bag of Holding lets you store those discarded cards in exile and then get them back to your hand by sacrificing Bag of Holding. Conspiracy Theorist lets you exile discarded non-land cards and cast them this turn. It also lets you filter through your deck when it attacks. You can pay 1 and discard a card to draw a card. Now, Conspiracy Theorist is just a squishy 2/2, so it doesn't attack very well, but again, we've got Subira to make it unblockable, so it's great here. Hazoret the Fervent loves it when you have no cards in hand. This 5/4 indestructible god can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. It's also a discard outlet, letting you pay 2 and a red and discard a card to deal 2 damage to each opponent. And also, red has access to several really janky effects that give you card advantage, but at a pretty severe cost. A Curse of Obsession, for example, has the cursed player draw 2 extra cards during their draw step, but they have to discard their hand at the beginning of their end step. I think you're supposed to put Curse of Obsession on one of your opponents, but in this deck, you'll typically curse yourself. Now, with all of your discard outlets and synergies, you'll negate a lot of the downsides associated with discarding your hand at the end of your turn with Curse of Obsession. Now, I also really like Experimental Frenzy. This enchantment lets you look at and play cards from the top of your library, any card. This is stupid card advantage, but it also says you can't play cards from your hand. But with all of our discard effects, we might not even have a hand anyways. And if you get really screwed, Experimental Frenzy does let you pay 3 and a red to destroy it, so you can play cards from your hand again. Now, as long as we're discarding our hand, Null Brooch lets us counter spells. This 4-mana artifact lets you pay 2 and tap it and discard your hand to counter a target 9-creature spell, which is great if your hand is already empty. Speaking of which, Girpir Orrery also rewards you for having an empty hand. This symmetrical artifact lets each player play an additional land on each of their turns, but more importantly, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. Now, I also really like Runehorn Hellkite. This is a 6-mana 5/5 dragon, so Subira wants nothing to do with it, but you can pay 5 and a red and exile it from your graveyard to Wheel of Fortune everyone. Of course, if you can reliably empty your hand, you'll get tons of value from being able to refill back up to 7 cards, and with all of our discard effects, we'll have no trouble getting Runehorn Hellkite into our graveyard to use that ability. Speaking of cards we love to discard, of course we'll play Anger. We can just discard it to give all of our creatures haste forever, or at least until our graveyard gets exiled. So we have several ways to use discard effects to damage our opponents, draw cards, and generally just generate value. And we can use Subira's second activated ability to get additional value from a lot of these effects. Now, we do have other synergistic pieces in this deck, but I want to take a quick break and talk about how we're going to make sure that our opponents don't kill us before we kill them. So it's time to talk about everyone's favorite subject. Of course, it's stacks. Our deck is filled with 1/1s and 2/2s. We're in mono red, so we basically can't kill creatures or enchantments. We can't gain life, we can't really block. So if we don't want to completely die to a tanked up Sigarda or some other nonsense, we're going to need a few stacks pieces. Now, the first one I want to mention is Meekstone. This 1-mana artifact says creatures with power 3 or greater don't untap during their controller's untap steps. Again, most of our creatures are power 2 or less, so that Subira can make them unblockable or draw cards when they deal combat damage using her second activated ability. Meekstone is a great speed bump for our opponents, but it mostly won't affect us at all. Now, I also like Ensnaring Bridge. This 3-mana artifact says creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. This card was just perfectly made for Subira. First, again, most of our creatures have low power, so if we can keep just 1 to 2 cards in hand, we can attack pretty easily. Secondly, our commander is an on-demand discard outlet. You can toss your hand anytime you want by paying 1 and a red and tapping Subira, even if you're not attacking, even if it's not your turn. So you can go down to 0 cards in hand whenever you want, which basically means nothing can attack at your discretion. Ensnaring Bridge will absolutely stall some decks, and yes, this is mean, but the alternative is just getting skewered by Sigarda, so it's a necessary evil. And just like Meekstone, Ensnaring Bridge is technically symmetrical. It affects all players, not just our opponents, so this is fair stacks, right? Of course, we can also play Magus of the Moon, the more vulnerable version of Blood Moon. This 3-mana 2/2 turns all non-basic lands into mountains, which will really screw up your opponent's mana bases, especially in more expensive or 4 and 5 color decks. But we're playing mono red, so this does almost nothing to us. And because it's a 2/2, Magus of the Moon can still wear some of our equipment like Scytheclaw, and Subira can make it unblockable, so it can provide additional value. We've got a few more Staxy pieces that don't stop our opponents from playing Magic, but they do punish them for playing Magic, which is totally different. Scabclan Berserker is a 2/2 with haste and renown 1. If it's renowned, it's basically a one-sided mini Rurk Thar. As whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, if Scabclan Berserker is renowned, it deals 2 damage to that player. Of course, Scabclan Berserker has to deal combat damage to a player to become renowned in the first place, but that's trivial with Subira. A Harsh Mentor and Immolation Shaman punish our opponents for activating non-mana abilities on their artifacts, creatures, and lands. Harsh Mentor does 2 damage when they do so, and Immolation Shaman deals 1 damage. And again, both of these creatures have 2 or less power, so Subira can make them unblockable. Now I also like Stigma Lasher. This is a 2-mana 2/2, and it has, whenever Stigma Lasher deals combat damage to a player, that player can't gain life for the rest of the game, which is hilarious. So those are some of our stacks pieces that help prevent our opponents from just completely running over us, because we have no defenses otherwise. Now let's talk about some of the more miscellaneous value pieces in this deck. Now, one version of Subira decks relies on token generators to swarm the battlefield with lots of creatures, and with large numbers of these small creatures, Subira's second activated ability can let you draw a bunch of cards. We're not focused on that playstyle in this deck, but we will use a few high-value creature token generators, because mass creature token generators can close out games, and those tokens can also be great chump blockers. Tillinolly's Summoner is the best example here. It's a 2-mana 1/1, and when it attacks you can pay 1 in a red, and if you do you make X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, and at the beginning of the next end step you exile those tokens unless you have the City's Blessing. First, you'll almost always have the City's Blessing, since you only need to have 10 or more total permanents on the battlefield at any time that Tillinolly's Summoner, or any other card with Ascend, is on the field or resolves, to get that City's Blessing for the rest of the game. So these 1/1 tokens will very likely stick around if they survive combat. And paying X mana to get X-1 tokens every single turn is a very good rate. Tillinolly's Summoner's biggest weakness is that if it dies in combat, you won't get to use its ability more than once. It's an attack trigger after all, so it has to attack. But Subira can make it unblockable, so Tillinolly's Summoner will easily survive combat and just pump out tons and tons of tokens for you turn after turn. We'll also use Loyal Apprentice, which just gives you a 1/1 flyer on each of your turns, as long as you control your commander. These are great chump blockers, or they can hold equipment like Umezawa's Jite or Scythemaw. There's Hanweir Garrison. It has 2 power, and when it attacks you make 2 1/1 red human creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. But it can also meld with Hanweir Battlements. This is a land that taps for colorless, and can also tap to give a creature haste, so that's pretty good all by itself. But you can also pay 3 red and tap Hanweir Battlements, and if you control Hanweir Garrison, you meld them together into Hanweir the Writhing Township. This is a 7/4 with Trample and Haste, and it makes 2 3/2 tapped and attacking Eldrazi tokens when it attacks. No, all of these are too big for Subira to make unblockable, but it's still a lot of damage, and it can be a great finisher. We'll also, of course, include Torbrand, Thane of Redfell, which adds to the damage dealt by all of our red sources. This is a great way to literally double or triple all of the damage our creatures will deal in combat. Not to mentioning really punishing our opponents when we use our Glinthorn Buccaneer or Harsh Mentor. Now when it comes to removal, we'll play with some red staples like Blasphemous Act, Chaos Warp, Tybalt's Trickery, but we have some synergistic pieces too. Demon Bolt deals 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker at instant speed, which is fairly mediocre, but you can also foretell it. So then you can discard your hand to something like Subira or Curse of Obsession, but you'll still have access to Demon Bolt, which is great. Aligned Hedron Network is a bit fragile as far as removal is concerned, but in this deck it can be very one-sided. When this 4-mana artifact enters the battlefield, it exiles all creatures with power 5 or greater until it leaves the battlefield. So again, this pretty much won't affect us at all, but it can absolutely destroy our opponents. Well, until they remove it, that is. Now for ramp, I've chosen to include Strixhaven Stadium. This is an alternative win condition, although you'll need to have a pretty established board to be able to put 10 point counters on it to win the game, or at least knock an opponent out of the game. But it's good to have as an option. Now when it comes to lands, we'll play an assortment of utility lands and basic mountains. A few of the notable inclusions are Castle Embreth, which is a decent combat boost for your team. You can pay 1 red and tap it to give all of your creatures +1/+0 until end of turn. Blinkmoth Nexus and Mutavault can animate into small creatures for just 1 mana, letting you get even more combat triggers for Subira. You can even equip them with your Sword of the Animist or Mask of Memory or whatnot for even more value. Access Tunnel and Rogue's Passage help make your creatures unblockable, and Gyre Reach Sanitarium and Seagate Wreckage help provide additional card draw and discard effects. And that's most of the deck. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. This Subira Tulzidi Caravanner deck has an average mana value of 2.83. Our commander needs other creatures to do anything at all, so this is a creature-heavy deck. We have 33 creatures, not counting the commander, and for all practical purposes, 28 to 30 of those creatures have power 2 or less, so Subira can make them unblockable and draw cards when they deal combat damage to a player if you've used her second activated ability. We have 22 attacking and combat damage payoffs. These can be creatures that do something when they attack or deal combat damage, like Prophetic Flamespeaker or Tillinali Summoner, but some of them are equipment like Scytheclaw that just reward you for dealing combat damage to a player. We have 10 cards that enable us to discard cards in some form or another, not counting our commander. And we have 8 cards that reward us for discarding. This deck has 10 sources of card advantage. Of course, being in mono red, these won't all be strictly card draw. Some of them are impulsive draw, like Grotag Nightrunner. And we also have 12 sources of ramp. And again, being in mono red, these won't all be permanent ramp. We have a variety of sources from mana dorks to treasure generation. Finally, we have 11 sources of single target removal and 5 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $206.51 on tcgplayer.com. This is a little higher than I typically build, but it's still fairly budget compared to the average EDH deck, which I think is a benefit of playing monocolor decks because your mana base can be so much more affordable. There are several $10 and up cards in this deck that I wouldn't recommend removing. Red, in my opinion, is a very vulnerable monocolor, and some of these cards will really help it survive. Ensnaring Bridge, for example, is $20, but this is one of only a very small number of ways that you're going to avoid getting smashed by giant creatures. Umezawa's Jite is also $20, but it can pump up your combat damage, and it's the only way you'll be able to gain life in this deck, which can be relevant. Grenzo Havoc Razor is another one. This one is over $20, but goading creatures is a great way to keep them from attacking you, and Grenzo synergizes amazingly with what this deck wants to do. So I don't have any recommendations to decrease the cost of this deck, again because I think once you do that, the weaknesses of mono red will become overwhelmingly a limitation to the deck's success. So that is Subira Tulzidi Caravanner. This one was a tough one for me to build because I really like having access to removal in my decks. And red is inherently weak when it comes to removing enchantments and creatures, especially creatures with high toughness, since most of its creature removal is damage based. Now because Subira is so combat focused, combat is going to be our primary win condition in this deck. But we do have backup options in things like Glinthorn Buccaneer and Browland to damage our opponents when we discard. Hate bears like Scanclad Berserker and Harsh Mentor will slowly drain out our opponents just for playing the game. And Strixhaven Stadium lets us translate our unblockable creatures into a faster and more terminal clock for our opponents, though again we do need to be in a fairly strong position before it'll let us win the game. Now I also like a lot of the decision points that Subira presents you with. You've got a lot of effects that reward you for discarding cards, but emptying your hand is still a risk, and it's not always going to be worth it. So you get to make a lot of choices when playing this deck, and to me that makes it a lot of fun. But that's all I've got for today. Please let me know what you think of Subira Tulzidi Caravanner in the comments. You can also hit that like button or dislike button if you need to, or especially that subscribe button if you want to see more unconventional Commander content like this. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.